Well, Father's Day is coming up, and a few years ago I had the privilege to speak before an organization called the Brotherhood of a New Destiny, run by Reverend Jesse Lee Peterson. It's a support group for men who grew up without fathers. Now let me give you the Cliff Notes version of how I got into radio. I'm a lawyer, as Jesse mentioned, and I was running a small business in Cleveland, Ohio, even though I'm from here. And I wrote an op-ed piece that got published in the newspaper. And the piece was about government being too large, taxing too much, regulating too much. And then I had one paragraph that said, and by the way, racism is no longer a major problem in America anymore. So I get a phone call from a producer of a radio show. He didn't care what I said about taxes, didn't care what I said about regulation. All he cared about was what I said about racism not being a major problem in America anymore. And for somebody black to say that about 25 years ago was revolutionary. He asked me if I would come on his guy's radio show and talk about it. So I was on the show for an hour. Now that I'm in talk radio, I know that when you have a guest on for a whole hour, that is an eternity. Normally you book somebody for one segment. If they stink, you can get rid of them. He had me on for a whole hour. And Cleveland is 50% black, so almost every phone call came from a black person. And I got called an Uncle Tom, a bootlicking Uncle Tom, foot-shuffling bootlicking Uncle Tom, Sambo Tom, coconut, brown on the outside, white on the inside, Oreo, same concept, the Antichrist, and then the name that you really call a black person when you really want to hurt his feelings, Republican. So I get back to my office. I said, I'll never do this again. And the station manager calls, and he says, I heard you today. He said, you were amazing. I said, I was? Oh my God, you were funny. You have a good voice. You took difficult positions. You defended them without losing your temper. Have you ever thought about doing talk radio? And I said, no. He said, I've got a guy going on vacation next week. Will you sit in for him? I said, no. He said, why? I said, I don't like being yelled at. I don't like being called a bunch of names. No, thank you. He said, are you married? At the time I was. He said, do me a favor, go home to your wife, talk this over, and I think maybe she'll convince you to change your mind. I said, I'll do that, but I doubt that she'll change my mind. So I went home to my then wife, Cindy, and I told her about this. She said, what do you think about talk radio? I said, I know very little about it. What little I know is it seems shallow, glib, and stupid. She said, it is. You'd be good at it. So I did it, fell in love with it. I met Dennis Prager. I got a 2-day audition at KBC, and I've been in talk radio now for about 25 years. One of the things that I've talked about time and time again is the importance of fathers in our lives. Back in 1965, a guy named Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who later on became a Democratic senator, wrote a report called The Negro Family, A Case for National Action. I was in college in 1970, and we read the book when I was a freshman. And most of the white kids, I went to an Ivy League school, only about 10% of the school was black. Most of the white kids called the man that wrote the book racist, patriarchal, and condemned him. And I'm sitting in the back, I raised my hand, I said, you know, I grew up in the inner city, and I'm beginning to see more and more single-parent households and seeing a lot of guys acting out, and I think maybe he's gone to something. So I got called an Uncle Tom by the white kids, and a bootlicking, shuffling bootlicking by the white kids, and Uncle Tom by the handful of black kids that were in the class. Same thing's happening right now. Fact is, in 1965, 25% of black kids were born outside of wedlock. The number now is 73%. And I didn't say this, Obama did. A kid raised out of dad is 5 times more likely to be poor and commit crimes, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, 20 times more likely to end up in jail. Tupac Shakur, speaking of him, he said, I know for a fact, had I had a father, I would have been more disciplined, I would have had more confidence. I once interviewed a guy named Kwesi Mfume. He used to be the head of the NAACP. One of the few so-called black leaders I can get on my show. I've called Jesse 50 times, Al Sharpton 50 times, Maxine Waters 100 times, they won't come on. But Kwesi Mfume did come on. And I said, Mr. Mfume, as between the presence of white racism or the absence of black fathers, which poses the bigger threat to the black community? Without missing a beat, he said, the absence of black fathers. It's a huge problem. And what we've done in our country is incentivize women to marry the government and allowed men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. When Lyndon Johnson launched the war on poverty, there is a quote that's attributed to him in a book written by a man named Ronald Kessler. And he said, once the effects of my new Great Society program filter down, I'll have these N-words voting Democrat for the next 200 years. I'm not saying there was a plot. What I'm saying is it created this disincentive that has destroyed families, not just black families. 25% of white families today are now born, white boys are now born outside of wedlock. 50% of Latinos are born outside of wedlock. The only percentage that's higher than the black percentage are Native Americans on reservations, 80%. And there's a direct relationship between that, dropping out of school, going to jail, all the other social problems that we talk about. Starts with the family. When I was growing up, I have two brothers, older brother, younger brother, I'm in the middle, and I could not stand my father. I could not stand the son of a bitch. Always mad, always surly, and never mad about the same thing, so you couldn't quite figure out what he's mad about. When my dad would come home, if we would have toys on the floor, my dad would kick the toys out of the way. Now these are, by that age, I'd already figured out there was no Santa Claus, and my mom brought all the gifts. So he's buying gifts, and because he's mad that they're on the floor, he'd kick them, and sometimes so hard that he would ruin them. He just seemed irrational to me, like this volcano of anger, and I did not get it. I wondered why he had kids. And when I was about 10 years old, my dad started a restaurant. He saved up his nickels and dimes and started a little cafe in the Pico Union area. So all of us worked for him. My brothers and I worked for him. Nobody liked working for him because he'd get mad and start screaming at you. It's a little diner. It's not even as big as this room, and 15 stools, so when my dad would yell at you, everybody in the restaurant could hear it, and it was embarrassing. And I'd like to say I had enough cashews to say the next time my dad yelled at me, I was going to have it out with him. But I said to myself, the next time he yells at me, I'm going to leave. And I did. The waitress called in sick that day, so there was a restaurant full of people, just my dad and me, and I walked out. My dad was pissed. And he came home, he paid me $10 a day plus tips. He had the $10, he balled it up at me, I was laying on my bed, and he said, why did you leave? And I said, I got tired of the way you spoke to me. And my dad turned around and walked out, and I did not speak to him for 10 years. When I say did not speak to him, I mean didn't speak to him. I mean, not even how about those Rams, do you think it was going to rain? We did not talk. I was able to graduate from high school, I went to college in the East Coast, and law school in the Midwest, and then worked in the Midwest, so I never talked to him for 10 years. I would call the house, my mom would answer the phone, I'd talk to her, I would never talk to him for 10 years. So I'm beginning to have a little difficulty sleeping. And I don't know why, but I'm beginning to think it probably has something to do with some sort of unresolved issue with my dad. I don't know. So I called my secretary and I said, cancel all my appointments, I'm going to LA. When I visited LA normally, I would call my mother and she'd meet me at the airport. But I didn't want anybody to know I was coming because I wanted to catch my dad cold. So I walked in, took a cab to the restaurant, walked in, 1:30, they closed at 2:30. I had both my bags. I walk in, my dad was stunned, and I said, I want to talk to you. He goes, fine, wait till we close. We close in about an hour. Shall I put your bags in the back? I said, no, Dad, I'm only going to be here for about 5 or 10 minutes. I was going to call him a son of a bitch. I figured he'd call me an ungrateful son. At least we clear the air. So my dad, I'm sitting there for an hour, and I'm saying to myself, all right, Larry, be cool. Don't tee off on him. Just very calmly explain to him why it is you have issues with him. And then he'll respond and tell you that you're ungrateful, and then we could be, that'll be that. So my dad sat there, and I teed off on him. And you know how I can be. I remembered every whipping, every beating, every time he took his belt off and hit me with it. Every time he told me to go out in the backyard and get a switch. The time that he hit me with the phone cord. This, that, and the other. I remembered every single thing he ever did. I talked for 20 minutes nonstop. Meanwhile, my dad would, from time to time, pour his coffee, reach over, pour some more coffee, and he took it. And he took it. And when I was done, he said, is that it? I said, yeah. He said, you didn't speak to me for 10 years because of that? I said, yeah. And my dad began telling me about his life. I didn't know anything at all about the man's life. There was kind of a no-fly zone over my dad's life. For the first of 2 times, I saw my dad cry. Second time was when my mom died. It was the first time I ever saw him cry. My dad said, let me tell you about my father. And I found out then at the age of 25 that my last name, Elder, is not the name of my dad's biological father. My dad never met his biological father, he told me then. The man Elder was in his life the longest. His mother had a series of boyfriends. She was illiterate. She could neither read nor write, which is why, by the way, my dad doesn't know his birthday. Wasn't born in a hospital, born in the back of a room. And because my grandmother was illiterate, couldn't even write down his birthday. When my dad enrolled in school, he's all telling me all this while we're sitting there. That's why the book is called Dear Father, Dear Son, 2 Lives, 8 Hours. We talk for 8 hours. Every now and then we get up to use the restroom. Outside of that, we talk for 8 hours. And my dad said when he enrolled in school, elementary school, lady said, what's your birthday? He said, I don't know. She wrote down May 25, which was her birthday. That's the birthday that we celebrated. So this man, Elder, was an alcoholic who who was physically abusive to his mother, physically abusive to my dad. He was a drunk. Every now and then he would work, and when he would work, he would give her the money because he knew that he would blow it drinking. So come Wednesday, he'd ask for the money. She wouldn't give it to him. He beat the crap out of her. My dad would intervene. He beat the crap out of him. That was Elder. And there was a bunch of other boyfriends in his life. My dad is 13 years old. He comes home from school, begins to quarrel with his mother's then boyfriend. She sides with the boyfriend, throws my father out of the house, never to return. 13 years old, Jim Crow South, Athens, Georgia, beginning of the Great Depression. Talk about a bad hand that you're dealt. And never went back. So my dad just goes down the road and tries to get somebody to give him some sort of job. Somebody hires him to clean the yard. Eventually, he's asked to come in and start cooking. He starts cooking. My dad then applies for a job as a Pullman porter. Some of you are old enough to remember Pullman porters were a prestigious job. These were the largest private employers of blacks in those days. So my dad got a job as a Pullman porter and was able to travel all over the country. Nobody in the South was able to travel all over the country. My dad came to LA one time and went, wow, it's sunny and warm, and people seem to be friendly. And so my dad made a mental note that maybe someday he might relocate to LA. Pearl Harbor, my dad joins the Marines. Anybody know what the Montford Point Marines are? These were the first black Marines. These were the equivalent of the Tuskegee Airmen. There were 20,000 of them from 1942 to 1949. My dad was one of them, and about 3 years ago, Congress gave them a Congressional Gold Medal. My dad got his posthumously at Camp Pendleton. Dana Rohrabacher arranged for my dad to get it. So I got a gold medal from my dad. He became a staff sergeant, was in charge of cooking facilities. The bombs fell, war's over, my dad goes back to Chattanooga where he had met and married my mom, and he went to restaurant to restaurant to restaurant to try to get a job as a cook, given all his experience, and he was told, time after time after time, we don't hire niggers. And my dad said, I've cooked for the military. We don't hire niggers. He goes to an unemployment office. He walks to the door. The lady sends him out, says he went to the wrong door. My dad goes out, sees colored only, goes to that door, to the very same lady who sent him out. My dad went home to my mom and said, this is BS. I'm going to Los Angeles, where people seem to be more fair. So this is 1946, 47. Comes to LA, goes to restaurant to restaurant to restaurant, and he's told, I'm sorry, you don't have any references, which is the way they do it in LA. My dad said, I'll work for you for free if you just give me a reference. They wouldn't do that. My dad goes to an unemployment office, this time one door, walks in, lady says, I've got nothing for you. My dad said, what time do you open? She said, 8:30. What time do you close? She said, 5:30. He said, I'll be sitting in that chair at 8:30. I'll be there until 5:30 until you find something. My dad sat in a chair for a day and a half. She calls him up. I got something, I doubt that you'll want it. My dad says, I'm sure I'll want it. What is it? She said, it's a job at Nabisco Breads cleaning toilets. My dad said, of course I'll take it. He took that job for 10 years, took a second job with Barber and Bread for 10 years, also cleaning toilets, cooked for a family on the weekend, and went to night school 2 to 3 times a week to get his GED. The man averaged about 4 hours of sleep a night. That's why he was so mad all the time. Can you imagine how you feel when you don't get good sleep? Decade after decade doing that. That's why he was cranky. And my dad then stayed with nickels and dimes, started a cafe called Elder Snack Bar, 1230 South Valencia. Taste the difference. And he ran that until his 80s. He was able to buy that piece of property, the one next door to it, and also the home where my mom and my dad lived. And my dad always told my brothers and me this: hard work wins. You get out of life what you put into it. You can't control the outcome, but you are 100% in control of the effort. And before you get mad at somebody else for what you think they've done to you, go to the nearest mirror and look into it and say, what could I do to change the outcome? And he also said, no matter how good you are, no matter how hard you work, sooner or later, bad things are going to happen. How you respond to those bad things will tell your mom and me whether or not we raised a man. And that's me. And that's what I believe, and that's how I've always lived my life. When Obama got elected, I'm old school, so my house, I have the New York Times, LA Times throne. Nobody does that anymore. I pick up the newspaper, and there's all these colored pictures of black families holding their babies, talking to their children, New York Times, LA Times, and all these parents are saying this: for the first time, I can now look at my son. For the first time, I can now look at my daughter and say, you can be anything you want to be now that this man is president. So I went on the air and I said, what if Obama had lost? What would these parents have told their kids? You didn't believe it when you said it before? I'm 7 years old. And my mom and I are sitting in my old house reading an illustrated book of presidents from George Washington to the then incumbent Dwight Eisenhower, every single one of them. Highlights, lowlights. And my mother closed the book when we were done and she said, Larry, if you want it bad enough, you work hard enough, someday you can be in this book. That was 1959. And I believed her. So I don't understand why it took Obama for people to realize that the country's changed dramatically and that you can be what you want to be, and life is a bunch of choices. My mom grew up on a farm. She grew up on a farm in Huntsville, Alabama. And the farm was in her family. So my mom was like royalty compared to my dad. She had a year of college, which is like having a PhD for a woman of her age. And my mom always, always, always told my brothers and me, no matter what anybody says to you, nobody can hurt your feelings without your permission. We were in class, high school, and we were reading this poem. And the poem went like this. While riding through old Baltimore so small and full of glee, I saw a young Baltimorean keep a looking straight at me. Now I was young and very small, and he was no whit bigger, and so I smiled. But he poked out his tongue and called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until September. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember. Well, I was pissed. Teacher was pissed. Class was pissed. Everybody was pissed. Teacher talked about how this was going to permanently stain this kid's psyche, that his self-esteem was always going to be low as a result of this. He'll always, always, always think of himself as a second-class citizen as a result of this. So I went home. My mom was in the kitchen stirring a big pot of greens. I'll never forget it. I said, Mom, we read this poem in class. I want to get your reaction to it. She said, what is it? I said, it goes like this. While riding through old Baltimore so small and full of glee, I saw a young Baltimorean keep a looking straight at me. Now I was young and very small, and he was no whit bigger, and so I smiled. But he poked out his tongue and called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until September. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember. My mother said, Larry, what a darn shame he allowed something so trivial to spoil his vacation. Whole different attitude than the teachers. I was just telling Jesse, we were talking about basketball and about Steph Curry and about LeBron James and some of these ball players. And I said, what a lot of people don't realize when they watch these players is not only are they skillful, not only are they good, but they also, especially the ones in the inner city like LeBron James, had to navigate through that to get there. Because for every LeBron James, I'm telling you, there's 20 of them out there in the playground right now. Same skill, just didn't do it. I was at my aunt's house one time, my aunt in Detroit. She kind of, almost like Jesse Lee, people would drop in and talk with her because she was so motivational. And I was in law school at University of Michigan. So I was visiting her, and I was telling her about my first year classes and what I was doing, and there was this guy who was there who was kind of a drinking buddy of my aunt's. And all of a sudden he starts crying. And I look up. I said, excuse me, did I say something wrong? And he said, I wanted to be a lawyer too, but I got involved in a bunch of jackassery. And I did this to myself. He didn't blame anybody. And I see this time and time and time again. There was a kid when I was growing up named Perry. Some of you probably know who Bo Jackson was. Yeah. Great athlete, amazing athlete, football player, baseball player, you name the sport, he did it. Well, this guy was like that. I'm telling you, every bit as good as Bo Jackson. He was the quarterback for the football team. He was the two-guard for the basketball team. He was the best pitcher in the baseball team. Perry picked up a tennis racket and started playing around with it and tried out for the tennis team after 2 weeks and made the team. You name the sport, he could do it. Yeah. But he had an attitude. And at the time, I didn't quite understand it. But he would not only beat you, but he would also berate you while he was beating you, so he was not popular in class. But I admired him because I always wanted to be an athlete and I wasn't. And he admired me because he always wanted to be more academically oriented and he wasn't. So we made kind of a funky little team. And when the coaches from Marquette and from UCLA and from Duke and from North Carolina came to scout him, everybody did, they talked to the coach. What's he like? Coach told the truth. He's a coach killer. You put this guy on your team, you won't be able to manage him. I can barely manage him, he said. And he told him about the time I was there. Perry came to practice late. He often came to practice late because he was the man. And for the first time, the coach lit into him, verbally tongue lashed him. Perry took off his jersey, threw it at the coach's face, and he started the next game because he wanted to win. And rather than sit his ass down and say, this is how it's going to be, This happened to him over and over and over again. I'll tell you one time, we were in the 3rd or 4th grade, and they were choosing the all-star players for kickball. I don't know if they still play kickball now. But I was an okay kickball player, but not as good as Perry. But Perry wasn't chosen because the kids didn't like him. So he's left off, even though by far the best kickball player in the class. So after the class was over, I went up to the teacher. We were friends, and I said, he didn't know I was going to do this. And I said, you know, it's not fair that Perry's not on the team. He's the best kickball player in the class, and because people don't like him, they've not chosen him. I don't think it's fair. I want to give him my seat. What she should have said was, he's going to have to learn that part of life is not just being good, but getting along with other people and not berating them. Instead, she said, okay, this is the kind of thing that happened to him his whole life. So when the coaches came and said, what's he like? Coach told the truth. Coach has his credibility on the line. He can't tell these college coaches a bunch of BS because that then would ruin his reputation. So he told the truth. So instead of going to Duke, bye-bye Marquette, bye-bye UCLA, bye-bye USC, he ended up going to Cal Poly Pomona, not a basketball school. So he's pissed. Starts smoking dope, starts missing class. Make a very long story short, we grew up not too far from each other in a small little house. He had a room in the back. Right now, as we speak, Perry is in that same house, and he's in the room in the back as we speak. All that potential. Changed his name to Abdul. I went away to college. I come home. I go to visit him. My name is Abdul. Don't call me Perry anymore. Why? Well, I'm not being be called by my slave name anymore. Call me Abdul. And I told him, well, you know, Arabs took more blacks out of Africa and took them to South Africa and the Middle East than white Europeans took blacks out of West Africa to North America. That's a lie. I said, oh, I don't know what I'm talking about. And he told me about how he was oppressed because of the man. I said, Perry, and he had a bunch of kids in the neighborhood listening to him at the time. I said, you can tell these kids all that BS. I know you. I've known you since the 2nd grade. We had the same teachers. So whatever the white man did to you, he did to me. How come he didn't hold me back? I said, what you did was on you. What you did was anger. And I found out later on about how much anger he had against his father. Generally speaking, when I grew up in the 60s, virtually nobody came from a single-parent household. There was one kid down the street named Greg who didn't have a mom, and she died, collapsed. First kid I know to lose his mom. Outside of that, everybody in my neighborhood had fathers. They had varying relationships with their fathers. All these fathers were World War II vets, Depression-era guys, tough guys. They were not like Ward Cleaver where you could talk to them about your problems. Everybody had issues like that with their dad, but they were there. But Perry didn't. And I did not realize the damage it was doing. It turns out his mom also was an alcoholic. I didn't even know that. Mrs. Brown always seemed fine to me, but when we got older, I found out that she was also drinking. So he was angry at his father, angry at the world, and took it out on everybody around him and ended up creating a self-inflicted wound that messed up his life. And the moral to the story is, everybody's life right now is a series of choices. Big choices, little choices, acts of omission, acts of commission, things you didn't do, things you did do, and ultimately they add up to put you where you are. And before you blame somebody else, you look in the mirror and ask yourself, what could I have done to change the outcome? Now, as you know, my father grew up without his father. And some years ago, my father and I were in the garage cleaning it out, and we came across a letter that my father had written to my brother when my brother was 2 years old. Why did he write the letter? My father told me he had a premonition that he was going to die at the age of 36. He died at 95, just a bit outside. But here's what he wrote to my brother to give him advice on how to get through life without my father being there to give him guidance. Kirk, my son, you are now starting out in life, a life that mother and I cannot live for you. So, as you journey through life, remember it's yours. So make it a good one. Always try to cheer up the other fellow. Learn to think straight. Analyze things. Be sure you have all the facts before concluding and always spend less than you earn. Make friends, work hard, and play hard. Most important of all, remember this. The best of friends wear out if you use them. This may sound silly, son, but no matter where you are on the 29th of September, Kirk's birthday, see that mother gets a little gift, if possible, along with a big kiss and a broad smile. When you are out on your own, listen and take advice, but do your own thinking and concluding. Set up a reasonable goal and then be determined to reach it. You can and will. It's up to you, son. Now, my father and I didn't always get along. He wasn't the warmest, fuzziest guy in the room. World War II crusty old Marine. So I wrote a book about an 8-hour conversation I had with him when I was 25 years old. I thought the conversation might be 5 or 10 minutes long, as you heard. It ended up being 8 hours. So the book is called Dear Father, Dear Son, 2 Lives, 8 Hours. The paperback has a different title, A Lot Like Me. Same book, different title. I urge you to consider giving it to whoever you think might benefit from it for Father's Day. I'm Larry Elder, and we've got a country to save. I will see you next time.